Alberta Grayson had refused 5 men in 3 years, and the 6th one had not even finished dismounting his horse before she turned her back and walked inside. The dust from Elias Crawford's departure still hung in the dry afternoon air of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, the summer of 1878, when Alberta's father came stomping through the front door of the Grayson Ranch house with his hat in his hand, and his face the color of a beet left too long in the sun. Harold Grayson was not a small man, and he was not a patient one, and the combination of those two qualities had served him well when he was building the ranch from nothing but 40 acres and a borrowed mule 20 years ago. But those same qualities had done him precious little good when it came to his eldest daughter, who possessed a will that made his own look like a soft suggestion. "Alberta," he said, his voice low and deliberate, the way a man speaks when he is trying very hard not to shout. "That was Elias Crawford. His family owns half the cattle north of Cheyenne." Alberta was standing at the kitchen basin, pouring water from a ceramic pitcher into a bowl, and she did not look up. "I am aware of who he was, father." "Then perhaps you can explain to me why you walked away from a man worth $40,000 before he even had the chance to say your name." "He said my name on his way up the drive," Alberta replied, setting the pitcher down with careful precision. "He called me Alberta like it was the name of a horse he was inspecting. Checked my posture, too. I saw him do it." She finally turned and looked at her father with brown eyes that were calm in the way of deep river water. "I am not livestock." Harold pressed his lips together and set his hat on the table. He pulled out the chair and sat down heavily, and for a moment he just looked at his daughter, this woman of 22 years who had her mother's eyes and her own impossible spirit. Her mother, God rest her soul, had been gone 6 years now, and Harold had spent most of those 6 years trying to do right by Alberta and her younger sister, Clara, in the way a man does when he is not entirely sure he knows how. "I'm not saying you are livestock," he said finally, his voice losing some of its edge. "I am saying that winter is coming and this ranch is not what it used to be. I am saying that a good match would mean security, for you, for Clara, for all of us." Alberta came to the table and sat across from him. She folded her hands in front of her and she looked at him directly, which was one of the things that both exasperated and privately impressed Harold Grayson about his firstborn. She never looked away when she was making a point. "Father," she said, "I know what this ranch costs to run. I know the north fence needs replacing and the well on the east pasture is going dry and we lost 11 head to that fever back in May. I know all of it. I keep the books. But I will not marry a man I cannot respect, and I will not respect a man who looks at me the way Elias Crawford did." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Outside, through the open window, they could hear Clara singing something to herself as she fed the chickens, and the sound of it was so ordinary and so sweet that it made the tension in the room feel slightly absurd. "What about Darnell Hobbs?" Harold asked. "You said he was too quiet." "He was not too quiet. He was hiding something. The way a man's eyes move tells you more than his words ever will, and Darnell Hobbs's eyes moved like a man who has something to hide." "Ezra Fleming, then." "Ezra Fleming drank 3 whiskeys before noon on the Sunday you invited him to dinner." "Thomas Acker." "Thomas Acker told me with a straight face that a woman's opinion on matters of business was like a candle in the wind, pretty to look at but ultimately useless." Harold rubbed his hand over his face. "Henry Booth." Henry Booth smelled like a man who had never made the acquaintance of soap and water. There was a pause, and then, despite himself, Harold Grayson let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. He tried to stop it, but it got away from him, and Alberta's mouth curved very slightly at the corner. "And Elias Crawford," Harold said, "and Elias Crawford inspected me like a heifer at auction." She paused. "Father, I am not asking to remain unmarried forever. I am asking to be married to a man I can actually stand to be in the same room with for the remainder of my natural life. I do not think that is an unreasonable request." Harold looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat, turned it twice in his hands, and stood up. "I have one more name," he said. Alberta looked at him with patient skepticism. Congressman Aldwell's brother-in-law, a man named— No, Alberta said. Harold stopped. You did not even let me finish. No, she said again, kindly but without any give in it. Not one chosen by a congressman, not one chosen by a cattle baron, not one chosen by you, father, though I love you dearly. When I find a man worth marrying, I will find him myself, and I will bring him to you, and I will say, this is the one, and I ask you to trust me enough to believe it when I do. Harold Grayson stood in his kitchen with his hat in his hand and his daughter watching him with those steady brown eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he had nothing left to say. He put the hat on. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned back once. Lord have mercy, Alberta, he said, but there was no real heat in it anymore. Then he went outside. Alberta let out a slow breath and turned back to the basin. Through the window, the afternoon light was long and golden over the Wyoming plains, painting everything in the colors of warm copper and dry grass, and somewhere out in the distance, a hawk was circling slow and patient above the ridgeline. She watched it for a moment, that hawk, just riding the thermals without any visible effort, as if the sky itself were holding it up, and she thought about what she had said to her father. She had meant every word of it. She just did not yet have any idea what the man she was waiting for would look like when he finally appeared. As it turned out, she would find out in the most unexpected way possible, and it would begin not with a formal introduction or a Sunday dinner invitation, but with a runaway horse and a broken wagon wheel on the road between Laramie and the town of Elk Ridge. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the sky was the particular shade of pale blue that only existed in early September just before the heat broke for good, Alberta had taken the buckboard into Elk Ridge to pick up a supply order from Thurston's General Store, which was a thing she did every few weeks when her father was occupied with the ranch work, and Clara was too young to drive the distance alone. She was a capable driver, comfortable with the 2 bay mares her father kept for light hauling, and the road between the ranch and Elk Ridge was one she had driven so many times she could have done it half asleep. Which was perhaps why she was not anticipating any particular difficulty when she heard the loud crack of the left rear wheel giving way beneath her, and felt the whole bed of the wagon drop and lurch sideways, with a grinding shriek that frightened both mares badly enough to set them lurching forward at a panicked trot that was trying very hard to become a run. Alberta did not scream. She planted her boots against the footboard, gathered the reins tight in both hands, and called to the horses in a sharp, firm voice, pulling back with steady pressure rather than sudden jerking, the way her father had taught her. It worked, the way it almost always worked when you did not panic, and the mares slowed and then stopped, breathing hard and shifting nervously, while the broken wagon sat at a drunken angle behind them with its left rear corner resting on the dirt road, and the fractured wheel splayed out to the side like a broken wing. Alberta sat there for a moment, the reins still in her hands, and took stock of the situation. She was approximately 4 miles from Elk Ridge and 6 from home. The road was not heavily traveled, but it was traveled, and there was no particular reason to assume she would be stranded for hours. She climbed down from the tilted seat with care, tied the mares to a nearby post fence that ran along somebody's east pasture boundary, and stood looking at the wheel with her hands on her hips. She heard the rider before she saw him, the steady rhythm of a horse at a purposeful canter coming up the road from the direction of Elk Ridge, and she turned to look. The man rode a gray horse, tall and well-built, with the easy, settled posture of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life in a saddle. He was wearing a brown canvas jacket, dark trousers, and a hat pulled down against the morning sun, and as he drew closer she could see that he was young, perhaps a few years older than herself, with a square jaw shadowed by a few days' growth of beard, and eyes that she could not yet make out the color of. He slowed when he saw her and the broken wagon, and then he pulled the gray to a stop a respectful distance away and swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion. He took his hat off as he approached, which she noticed. "Looks like you've had some trouble," he said. His voice was quiet and straightforward, not overly friendly, not cautious, just matter of fact. His eyes were gray, she could see now, gray like the horse. "Rear wheel," she said. "The spoke was already cracked. I should have caught it before I left this morning." He walked past her to look at the wheel without asking her permission, which could have been rude but somehow was not, because he did it the way a man looks at a problem he intends to solve rather than the way a man asserts ownership over a situation. He crouched down and examined the brake, turning the fractured sections with his hands. "Clean brake," he said. "Didn't hit anything hard, just gave way on its own." He stood and turned to look at the mares, then at the road ahead, then back at her. "I have a spare wheel hitch strap in my saddlebag, but I don't have a replacement wheel. Thurston's usually keeps a few in the back. I'm headed into Elk Ridge anyway. I can ride ahead and bring one back, or I can ride you into town and we can get the wagon sorted from there." Alberta looked at him steadily. He was a stranger, and she was alone on a road 4 miles outside of town, and most women in her position would have been at least a little wary. But there was something about the way he held himself that was not threatening in the slightest. He was not looking at her the way men sometimes looked at women they thought were helpless. He was looking at her the way a person looks at another person who has a problem they might be able to help with. "What brings you out this way?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she knew he would know why she was asking it. He met her eyes without flinching. "I was hired 3 weeks ago to work the Kendall spread east of Elk Ridge. Headed into town for supplies and to see about a land parcel Kendall wants me to survey." He paused. "I'm Wallace Slater. I came up from Colorado about a month back." "Alberta Grayson," she said. "My father runs the Grayson Ranch west of here." Something shifted very slightly in his expression, but she could not immediately identify what it was. "Harold Grayson's daughter. You know my father. Know of him. He has a reputation for running good stock. I passed your property on the way in from Colorado." He paused again in that thoughtful way he had, not the pause of a man searching for words, but the pause of a man who was careful about which ones he used. "I'll ride you into Elk Ridge if you're agreeable. We can arrange for someone to bring a wheel back out here." She considered him for another moment. Then she untied the mares and led them off the road to a patch of grass where they could graze safely, looped their lead ropes to the fence, and turned back to him. "That would be helpful," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Slater." He held his horse steady while she mounted behind him, which she did without ceremony, pulling herself up and settling with her hands resting on her own knees rather than around his waist, because she did not know this man and she maintained her dignity in all circumstances. He said nothing about it. He just urged the gray forward at an easy, comfortable pace, and they rode toward Elk Ridge in the September morning air, with the open Wyoming plains spreading out golden around them in every direction. They rode in silence for a while, the kind of silence that can be awkward or comfortable depending on the people in it, and this one was comfortable in a way that Alberta found faintly surprising. She was not generally uncomfortable with silence, but sometimes silence with a stranger had a texture of effort to it, of two people trying not to say the wrong thing. This had none of that. "You said you came from Colorado," she said eventually. "Ranch work mostly. Spent 2 years near Pueblo." He paused. "Before that, New Mexico Territory. And before that," another thoughtful pause, "Kentucky, born there, left when I was 17. He did not offer more and she did not push because the tone of it was not secretive, just private, the way some things were. "What made you come up to Wyoming?" "Work," he said simply. Then, after a moment, "And I heard the country was different up here. Bigger sky." Alberta glanced up at the sky above them, which was indeed vast and pale and infinite in all directions. "It is that," she agreed. When they reached Elk Ridge, Wallace Slater helped her arrange for a replacement wheel to be brought out to the wagon by a man named Pete Barker, who ran a small livery and did odd jobs, and then he tied his horse at the rail outside Thurston's and held the door of the general store for her without making a production of it. Inside, old Cyrus Thurston was behind the counter with his reading spectacles on the end of his nose, and he greeted Alberta with the easy warmth of long familiarity. "Miss Grayson. Your orders all packed up out back, and who's this?" "Wallace Slater," Wallace said, extending his hand over the counter. "I work for the Kendall Ranch." "Kendall's man," Thurston said, shaking his hand and peering at him over the spectacles. "He sent word you might be in, said you were a fair hand with survey work too. I've done some. Useful skill out here," Thurston said approvingly. He looked between Wallace and Alberta with the particular bright interest of a man who notices everything. "You two come in together. Mr. Slater was kind enough to give me a ride when my wagon wheel gave out on the North Road," Alberta said smoothly. "Good of you," Thurston said to Wallace, and the look he gave him was warmly assessing. They collected their respective orders, and Wallace carried Alberta's crates out to the buckboard that Pete Barker had arranged to bring around from the back while the wheel repair was being organized. He stacked them without being asked, and without showing off, just efficiently and practically. And Alberta watched him and thought that here was a man who helped without making you feel helped, which was rarer than people seemed to realize. When everything was arranged, they stood for a moment outside Thurston's in the mid-morning sun. The main street of Elk Ridge was busy with its usual commerce, a few horses tied at various rails, a woman in a blue dress going into the milliner's, two cowboys talking at the corner, a dog sleeping in a patch of shade. "Well," Alberta said, "thank you, Mr. Slater. You saved me a long walk." It was no trouble. He held her gaze with those steady gray eyes, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite categorize, something careful and genuine at the same time. "I hope the rest of your day is less eventful." She felt the corners of her mouth move. "I rarely count on it," she said, "but I appreciate the sentiment." He tipped his hat. She got into the buckboard, which was now waiting for her with Pete Barker holding the mare steady, and she drove away down the main street of Elk Ridge without looking back. But when she reached the bend in the road and the town fell behind her, she thought about those gray eyes and that quiet voice, and the way he had not once in their entire interaction looked at her like she was a problem to be managed or a prize to be acquired. She thought about it for a long time on the way home. She thought about it for several days after. She thought about it enough that, when Clara noticed her sister was distracted at dinner one evening, Alberta deflected so smoothly that Clara was halfway through her own meal before she realized she had not actually gotten an answer. But Clara, who was 17 and observant in the way of younger sisters everywhere, had a way of watching Alberta that missed very little, and by the end of the week she had put together enough fragments to have a fairly strong suspicion about the direction of her sister's thoughts. "Who is he?" Clara asked, point blank, one afternoon when they were hanging washing on the line behind the house, and their father was out with the ranch hands repairing the fence he had been putting off for 2 months. Alberta did not pretend not to understand the question. She also did not answer immediately, because she was working through a sheet that had gotten tangled, and she always finished what she was doing before she spoke. "His name is Wallace Slater," she said, when the sheet was on the line. "He works for Kendall's ranch east of Elk Ridge." Clara's eyes were wide and delighted. "How did you meet him?" Alberta told her about the wheel and the ride and Elk Ridge, and the whole time she was talking, Clara was watching her with that bright, attentive look that meant she was cataloging everything for later consideration. "And you like him?" Clara said, not as a question. "I don't know him," Alberta said carefully, "but you like what you saw of him." Alberta picked up the next sheet. "He was decent and capable and did not speak to me as though I lacked the intelligence to understand what he was saying." "These are not high standards, Clara, but they are apparently rare ones." Clara laughed, which was a bright, unself-conscious sound that always made Alberta feel a little lighter. "When are you going to see him again?" "I don't know that I am. You should find out." Alberta looked at her sister over the line of hanging washing. Clara was 17, with their mother's dark curls and their father's stubborn enthusiasm for life, and she had a directness about her that Alberta recognized because it was a quality they shared, though Clara expressed it with considerably more delight than Alberta typically allowed herself. "Perhaps," Alberta said. it was not a no. It was not, as it turned out, a no at all. Because 3 days later, Alberta rode into Elk Ridge again, this time on her own horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Florence, nominally to pick up a letter their father was expecting from his bank in Cheyenne. She did not tell herself she was hoping to see Wallace Slater. She simply rode to Elk Ridge and collected the letter. And then, because she was there and it seemed natural, stopped into the small establishment that Mrs. Beatty ran as a combination bakery, an informal gathering place for the women of the town. Mrs. Beatty was a broad, cheerful woman with flour perpetually on her apron, and an encyclopedic knowledge of everything that happened within 20 miles in any direction. She was also one of the few women in Elk Ridge whom Alberta genuinely liked, because Mrs. Beatty had a sharp mind underneath the cheerfulness and a kindness that was brisk rather than saccharine. Alberta was sitting at the corner table with a cup of coffee and one of Mrs. Beatty's excellent butter biscuits when the door opened and Wallace Slater walked in. He did not see her immediately. He went to the counter and spoke to Mrs. Beatty in that quiet, straightforward way of his, and Alberta watched him without quite meaning to, noting the set of his shoulders and the way he listened when Mrs. Beatty spoke, really listened, with his eyes on her face rather than scanning the room. Then he turned because Mrs. Beatty had said something that made him glance around and he saw Alberta. Something happened in his expression. It was brief and controlled, but it was there. A small stillness and then a kind of warmth that he did not try to arrange or manufacture. He crossed the room to her table. "Miss Grayson," he said. "Mr. Slater," she said, "are you in the habit of frequenting Mrs. Beatty's establishment?" "Mrs. Beatty's biscuits are the best in 3 counties," he said. "I'm not too proud to admit it." Mrs. Beatty, who had excellent hearing, called from behind the counter, "Smart man." Alberta smiled. It was a real smile, not the polite, controlled one she gave to the men her father brought to the ranch, but the kind that started in her eyes. Wallace noticed. She could see that he noticed, though he did not make anything of it. "Would you care to sit?" she asked. He did, and they talked. Not about anything particularly consequential at first, the kind of conversation people have when they are learning each other's rhythms, the land, the cattle prices, the drought conditions that had been worrying ranchers from Colorado to Montana all through the summer of 1878. But gradually, the way it happens when 2 people discover that the other one is actually interesting, the conversation deepened. He had opinions about land management that were informed and practical. She told him about keeping the Grayson Ranch books, and he listened to what she actually said rather than waiting politely for her to stop. She mentioned the water situation on the east pasture, and he offered, without condescension, 2 specific suggestions based on similar problems he had seen in Colorado, and she considered them seriously and told him which one she thought was more feasible for their particular terrain, and he agreed with her reasoning. Mrs. Beatty brought 2 more cups of coffee without being asked, and she did it with a carefully neutral expression that fooled neither of them. An hour passed without either of them noticing. "Your father," Wallace said at some point, and his tone was thoughtful rather than cautious. "Is he the sort of man who would object to his daughter having a conversation with a ranch hand?" Alberta looked at him directly. "My father is the sort of man who has introduced me to 6 men in 3 years whom he considered suitable matches. I declined all of them." Wallace was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Why?" "Because none of them could look at me and see a person rather than an arrangement." She said it plainly, without self-pity or drama. "I am my father's daughter and I love him, but he selects men based on their bank accounts and their land holdings, which are not nothing, but they are not everything." "No," Wallace agreed quietly. "They're not everything." There was a pause that was full of something neither of them named. "What would you say if you found a man worth marrying?" he asked. Not boldly, not with any particular implication, just as if he was curious about her. Alberta looked at the coffee cup in her hands for a moment and then back up at him. "I told my father that when I found him I would bring him home and say, 'This is the one.'" She paused. "I meant it." Wallace held her gaze steadily. "I believe you," he said. They sat there in Mrs. Beatty's warm bakery with the September sunlight coming through the window and the smell of fresh bread in the air, and something had shifted between them, not dramatically, not with any grand declaration, but in the way that things shift when they are becoming real. After that, it was not accidental. After that, they arranged to meet, though they did so with the circumspect practicality of people who understood that there were eyes everywhere in a small community, and that rumors, once started, were difficult to put down. Wallace rode out toward the Grayson ranch one afternoon the following week on the pretext of discussing a boundary survey that the Kendall property shared with the adjacent land, and the road to the Kendall ranch happened to pass within a mile of Grayson land, and Alberta happened to be checking on the east pasture well that afternoon. They met at the fence line as if by chance, and stood talking for an hour with Florence and the gray horse cropping grass companionably on their respective sides of the fence. He told her about Kentucky, a little more this time, about growing up the third of 4 sons on a tobacco farm that never had quite enough money and always had too much pride, about leaving at 17 because there was no future for him there that was not already spoken for, and riding west with nothing but a good horse, a strong back, and the stubborn certainty that he could make something of himself if he could just find the right ground to do it on. She told him about her mother, which she did not often do, about Alberta Grayson, who had been a school teacher before she married Harold, and who had taught Alberta not just to read and write and cipher, but to think, to really think, and who had died of typhoid fever in the spring of 1872 when Alberta was 16 and Clara was 11, and the grief of it had reshaped all of them in ways that were still visible if you knew where to look. "She sounds extraordinary," Wallace said. "She was," Alberta said simply. "You sound like her." Alberta looked at him. It was such a specific and generous thing to say that for a moment she did not know what to do with it. She was not a woman who was easily undone by flattery because she had too much sense for that, and too much experience with men who used compliments as tools. But this was not flattery. He said it the way you state a fact, calmly and with conviction, and the effect of it was something entirely different. She looked away at the horizon and then back at him. "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time," she said, and her voice was steady, but the steadiness was something she was working for. Wallace was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I don't mean to be presumptuous, Miss Grayson." "Alberta," she said, "if we're going to stand at fence lines talking about our mothers, you might as well call me Alberta." His mouth curved then, a real smile that changed his whole face, made it warmer and younger and slightly startling, and she thought that he had a genuinely good smile, the kind that a man did not deploy strategically but that appeared when something genuinely reached him. "Alberta," he said. "Wallace." It was such a small thing, and it was not a small thing at all. Over the following weeks, as September settled into October and the Wyoming air grew crisp and cold, and the plains turned from gold to brown to the first tentative white of early frost, they met when they could and corresponded when they could not. Alberta was not accustomed to writing letters to men, but she found that writing to Wallace was not like that. She wrote to him the way she thought, directly and without ornament, and his replies were the same. He had an unexpectedly precise way with written language, self-taught and economical, with occasional flashes of something that she could only call poetry, not in the flowery sense but in the way of a man who sees the world clearly and knows which words carry the most weight. She began to know him the way you come to know the land around you, not all at once but gradually, season by season, until you realize that you know where every stone is and what the sky looks like before rain and how the light falls in the afternoon, and that this knowledge has become something you cannot imagine being without. She knew that he woke before dawn every morning without needing to be told to, because he had done it since he was a child, and it had become as natural as breathing. She knew that he was better with horses than most men she had ever met, not through force but through patience, through understanding what the animal was feeling and working with it rather than against it. She knew that he could be quiet for long stretches without it meaning anything was wrong, that the quiet was simply where he lived comfortably. She knew that he had a dry, understated humor that appeared at unexpected moments, and that made her laugh in a way she had not laughed in a very long time. She knew, by the middle of October, that she was falling in love with him. She did not say it to herself in those exact words, because she was a careful woman and she did not make declarations until she was certain. But she recognized the evidence of it the way she recognized the evidence of anything, by its effects on the surrounding world. The way a morning became different because she might see him later. The way she found herself thinking through conversations they had had, turning them over, finding new things in them. The way his absence on the days when they did not meet had a specific weight to it that she had never experienced before. She had not told her father anything. She was not sure how to begin, because she knew that Harold Grayson's response to, "I have been meeting with a ranch hand from the Kendall spread who came up from Colorado a month ago, and I believe I am falling in love with him," was not going to be a simple one. It was Clara who finally brought it to a head, in the indirect but effective way that younger sisters have always managed these things. Clara had seen Wallace once at a distance, when she had ridden out to find Alberta on the east pasture and arrived in time to see her sister and a man on a gray horse talking at the fence line. She had not interrupted. She had turned her own horse around and ridden back to the house and waited until dinner to give Alberta a look across the table that communicated about 14 separate things simultaneously. Alberta had answered the look with one that said, "Later." Later came that night in their shared room, with the lamp turned low and the wind picking up outside in the way it did in October in Wyoming, that long low moan across the empty miles of plain. Clara sat cross-legged on her bed and listened to everything Alberta told her, and when Alberta was done, Clara said, "You have to tell Father." "I know," Alberta said. "He will not like it at first. I know. But he will come around because he loves you and because he is a better man than he sometimes appears when he is being stubborn." Alberta looked at her sister with great affection. "When did you become so wise?" "I have always been wise," Clara said. "You have just been too busy being the responsible one to notice." Alberta laughed quietly and then grew serious again. "I am going to talk to Wallace first, before I say anything to Father. There are things that need to be said between us, and I will not go to my father about a man who has not made anything clear himself." Clara nodded seriously. "That's fair." "And I need to know," Alberta said quietly, "that what I think I feel is what he feels too. Not just that he enjoys my company, but that she stopped." "That it is real," Clara supplied. "That it is real," Alberta agreed. It was the second week of October when Alberta rode out to the east pasture early in the morning, before her father was up, and sent a note to the Kendall ranch with one of the Grayson hands who was making a regular run in that direction. The note was brief. It said that she would be at the south end of the east pasture fence at noon if he was available, and that she had something she wanted to discuss with him. He was there when she arrived, the gray horse already tied to a fence post and Wallace standing with his hat in his hands, and his face turned toward her as she came across the frost-stiffened grass. It was a cold, clear day, the kind that made everything look cut sharp, the mountains on the horizon absolutely precise against the blue of the sky, the dried grass making a soft sound under Florence's hooves. She dismounted and tied Florence beside the gray, and they stood facing each other with the open plain behind them and the cold air carrying their breath away in small white clouds. "I got your note," he said. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," she said. "But I have been thinking about something for a while now, and I need to say it plainly rather than going on thinking it without knowing if it means anything." He was very still. That quality of attention he had, the way he gave it completely. "I have been meeting with you for 6 weeks," she said. "And I have found, over those 6 weeks, that I think about you when I am not with you, and that I value your company more than I have valued the company of any man I have ever met, and that I would like to know whether any of this is mutual, because if it is not, I would rather know now than later." She said it looking directly at him, because she did not believe in evasion when directness was available. Her heart was beating faster than she would have liked, but her voice was steady and her eyes were steady, and she was who she was regardless of how he answered. Wallace looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes, and then he said, in that quiet, deliberate way of his that she had come to know so well, "Alberta, I have thought of very little else but you since the morning I found you standing next to a broken wagon wheel on the north road." She breathed, just breathed, which she had been doing somewhat inadequately for the last 30 seconds. "I am not a wealthy man," he continued. "I have land sense and skill and a willingness to work harder than most, and I have made enough savings over these years to be thinking seriously about my own property. But I do not have what the men your father likely has in mind for you could offer." "I have already told you what the men my father had in mind for me could not offer," she said, "and I have not changed my view of the matter." He took a step toward her, just one step, careful and deliberate. "I want to do this properly. I want to speak to your father." "You should know," she said, "that my father is going to be surprised. He does not know you. He has never met you. He has a very specific idea of the sort of man he has been looking for." "I know," Wallace said. "That does not change what I want." She looked at him, this man she had found on a broken road in the middle of Wyoming, this man she had not been looking for and had found anyway, and she thought about what she had told her father all those weeks ago. "When I find a man worth marrying, I will find him myself, and I will bring him to you and I will say, 'This is the one.' Come to dinner on Saturday," she said. "I will speak to my father before you come." Wallace nodded. "Saturday." And then, because they were standing close and the morning was cold and everything had just been said that needed to be said, he reached out and took her hand, just held it in both of his for a moment, and the warmth of it in the cold air was something she felt all the way through. She rode home with her heart full of something she had been waiting a long time to feel. Telling her father was not, as she had anticipated, a simple conversation. She chose Friday evening after dinner, when Harold was in his chair by the fire with his coffee, which was when he was at his most receptive and his least combative. Clara made herself scarce with suspicious speed, disappearing upstairs with a book she had been ostentatiously reading for the past 2 days. Alberta sat down across from her father and folded her hands in her lap, the same posture she had used 6 weeks ago when she had told him she would find the man herself. Harold looked at her, and something in his expression already knew that a conversation was coming. "Father," she said, "I have invited a man to dinner tomorrow evening." Harold was quiet for a moment. "A man you chose yourself," he said slowly. "Yes." Another pause. "Who is he?" "His name is Wallace Slater. He is 26 years old. He came up from Colorado about 2 months ago and has been doing ranch and survey work for Jonas Kendall east of Elk Ridge." She paused. "He is from Kentucky originally. He left when he was 17 and has been making his way in ranch work ever since. He is skilled with horses, has experience in land survey, has saved enough to be seriously considering his own property, and he is honest and capable and—" "How long have you known him?" Harold asked. 6 weeks. Harold set his coffee cup down. 6 weeks. He looked at the fire for a moment. "And this is the man." "Yes," Alberta said quietly, "this is the man." Harold Grayson was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the October wind pushed against the windows. Alberta waited. "You said you would know," Harold said finally. His voice was not angry, it was something more complicated than that. "I said I would know," she agreed. "I cannot say I am not surprised," Harold said. "A man from Kendall's ranch, a man I have never heard of." He paused. "A man you found on your own." "Yes, father, a man I found on my own." Harold looked at her, and in his face was the whole long history of their relationship, his stubbornness and her stubbornness, and the love underneath both of them and the grief they shared, and the years of him trying to do right by her, and not always knowing what right meant. "Bring him to dinner," Harold said. "I will judge for myself." "That is all I am asking," Alberta said. "Judge him for yourself, not against any other standard except who he is." Harold picked up his coffee again. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday." She stood and went upstairs, and when she passed Clara's room she knocked once, and Clara immediately opened the door with a face full of questions, and Alberta said, "He's coming to dinner," and Clara grabbed her arm and said, very quietly so as not to be heard from below, "Tell me everything." Saturday came with the first true hard frost of the season, which put a brilliant cold clarity on everything, the mountains sharp as cut glass, the sky a blue so deep it was almost purple at the zenith. Alberta spent the morning in the kitchen with Clara helping prepare a proper dinner, because that was what you did, and because keeping her hands busy was useful. She was not nervous, exactly. Or rather, she was, but it was not the anxious, uncertain kind of nervousness that comes from not knowing what you feel. It was the kind that comes from caring about the outcome of something important. There was a difference. Wallace arrived at 5 o'clock in the evening, which was precisely when she had told him to arrive, and he rode up on the gray horse wearing a clean white shirt and a dark vest and his best hat, and he looked exactly like himself, which was to say honest and capable and not trying to be anything other than what he was. And Alberta, watching from the window, thought that this was one of the things she loved most about him. She went to the door when she heard his knock, and when she opened it, he was standing on the porch with his hat in his hand and his eyes going to her face first, not past her into the house, not toward the interior in assessment of the situation, but to her as if she was the thing that mattered most about being here. "Alberta," he said quietly. "Wallace," she said, "come in." Harold Grayson was in the sitting room, standing by the fireplace in his good coat, and he turned when Wallace came in, and the two men looked at each other with the frank assessment of men who do not bother with pretense. Harold was broad and weathered and 52 years old, with the air of a man who had built something real with his hands and knew exactly how much it had cost him. Wallace was lean and straight with that quality of settled attention about him, meeting Harold's gaze without aggression and without deference, just honest and direct. They shook hands. Harold held it a moment longer than necessary, the way men do when they are measuring something. "Slater," he said. "Mr. Grayson," Wallace said. "Thank you for having me." "Sit down," Harold said. "We'll talk before dinner." Clara appeared from the kitchen doorway with the good timing of someone who had been listening, caught Alberta's eye, and made a small encouraging gesture that only Alberta could see. The talk before dinner was, by any measure, not easy. Harold Grayson was not a man who softened his questions, and he asked Wallace the kind of direct, unsparing things that he would have asked any man who came to his house with his eye on his daughter. What was his financial standing? What were his plans? What did he believe a man owed to a woman he married? What kind of life did he envision, and how did he intend to build it? Wallace answered every question without hesitation and without exaggeration, which was harder than it sounded, because some of the answers required him to acknowledge what he did not yet have alongside what he did. He was honest about his savings and his ambitions and his plans, and he was honest about the timeline, that it would take time to establish his own ground, that he was not a wealthy man. He was also honest, and this was the part that made Harold go quiet for a moment, about what he offered that could not be measured in land or money. "I will not pretend I can give your daughter what a man with 40,000 acres could give her materially," Wallace said. "But I can tell you that I have spent 6 weeks learning who she is, and I have not found a single part of her that I do not respect and admire and want to know better for the rest of my life. I know that may not be enough for you, but I believe it is the foundation of something that cannot be bought." Harold was quiet for a long moment after that. He was looking at his hands, which were folded on his knee, and then he looked up at Wallace with an expression that was doing several things at once. "My daughter," he said slowly, "has turned down every man I selected for her, 6 of them over 3 years, men with good names and good money and good prospects." He paused. She never brought a single one of them to me herself. Never said, "Father, this is the man." He paused again. Until now. The room was very quiet except for the fire. "She chose you herself," Harold said. "And in all the years I have been her father, Alberta Grayson has never been wrong about a thing she chose for herself. I may not always have liked it at the time." A ghost of something moved through his expression. "But she has never been wrong." Wallace held the older man's gaze steadily. "I am not giving you my blessing tonight," Harold said. "I am giving you my respect and a meal and my honest consideration. The rest will take time." "I understand," Wallace said. "I would not expect otherwise." Dinner was good and the conversation was careful, and then it became less careful, because Harold Grayson, whatever his faults, was genuinely intelligent and genuinely curious, and Wallace Slater was genuinely intelligent and genuinely interesting. And the two men found common ground in the practical realities of land and cattle and water management, in a way that Alberta watched with quiet satisfaction from across the table. Clara, seated beside Wallace, decided within 15 minutes that she liked him enormously, and began asking him questions about Colorado with the frank enthusiasm of a 17-year-old who has been following a story for 6 weeks and is finally getting to meet a character from it. When dinner was over and the plates were cleared and they were all in the sitting room again with coffee, Harold looked across at his daughter. "You said," he told her, "that you would know the man when you found him." "I did," Alberta said. Harold looked at Wallace, then back at his daughter, and then he said something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "I believe you," he said. Not a blessing, not a full endorsement, but it was the first time in 3 years of this conversation that Harold Grayson had said those 2 words in that direction, and the weight of them was considerable. Wallace left that evening with a handshake from Harold and a whispered, "He is wonderful," from Clara, and a quiet moment alone on the porch with Alberta, where the frost-cold air was sharp and the stars over Wyoming were outrageous in their brightness, the way they could be out on the open plain far from any lamp or lantern. "Your father is not a simple man," Wallace said. "No," Alberta agreed. "He is not, but he is a fair one underneath all the complexity." "I think so too." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to do this right, Alberta. I want to court you properly with your father's knowledge and his gradual approval, and I want to—" He stopped, and the thing he stopped himself from saying was visible in his face, and she knew what it was. "I know," she said softly. "So do I." He looked at her in the starlight and she looked back at him, and the cold air was between them and around them, and they were standing close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she had wanted to. She put her hand on his arm just for a moment, just briefly. "Come back next week," she said. He came back the next week, and the week after that. Through October and into November, Wallace Slater came to dinner at the Grayson Ranch with increasing regularity, and Harold Grayson, who had spent 3 years selecting men for his daughter with diminishing success, watched the one she had selected for herself and slowly, measurably, came around. It was not a fast process. Harold had questions about Wallace's land plans, and Wallace answered them with increasingly specific detail as he worked through his intentions, having conversations with the land agent in Elk Ridge about 2 separate parcels that were available north of town. He brought Harold into these conversations at Harold's obvious interest, and the older man, who knew this land better than almost anyone, had opinions that Wallace genuinely considered rather than politely deflected. Alberta watched this process with a feeling that was warm and complicated and entirely pleasant. She had not expected her father to capitulate easily, and he did not capitulate easily, and she respected him for it even while she was impatient with it. But she could see, by the 3rd week of November, that the capitulation was coming, because Harold Grayson was a proud man but not a foolish one, and it had become increasingly difficult to be in the same room with Wallace Slater and not recognize what he was. What he was became even clearer in the 3rd week of November, when a situation arose that had nothing to do with romance or land or courtship, and everything to do with the kind of character a man had when things went sideways. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Wallace had ridden over to consult with Harold about one of the land parcels, a routine visit now, when word came with one of the ranch hands that there was a fire on the east pasture fence line. Not a big fire, not a catastrophic one, but in the dry autumn conditions, it was the kind of thing that could become catastrophic very quickly if it was not handled immediately. And Harold was already out the door before the hand had finished talking. Wallace was right behind him. Alberta came out of the house to see what was happening, understood the situation in about 5 seconds, and went to the barn to help with the horses while the men organized the response. She was not a woman who stood on a porch watching. She knew where the buckets were and how to work a water chain, and she joined the line of hands that formed from the well to the fence line with the calm efficiency of someone who had grown up on a working ranch and knew that a fire did not care about your nerves. They got it under control in 40 minutes. A small strip of dry fence grass and 2 fence posts, which could be replaced. No animals lost, no structures threatened. When it was over, everyone was sooty and tired, and relieved in the way you are when the worst has not happened. Harold was standing at the fence line looking at the blackened posts when Wallace came to stand beside him. They were both dusty and smelling of smoke, and for a moment they just looked at the damage together in the quiet way of men who have just dealt with something difficult. "Could have been worse," Harold said. "Could have been much worse," Wallace agreed. "You want me to come back tomorrow to help replace these posts? I can get the lumber from Thurston's on the way." Harold looked at him sideways. Then he looked at the posts again. "I would appreciate that," he said. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a turning point in any obvious sense. But Alberta, watching from 30 yards away with her hands wrapped around a water bucket and soot on her face, saw the 2 men standing at the burned fence line in the cold afternoon light, and she knew that something had shifted. Wallace came back the next day with the lumber, and he and Harold replaced the fence posts together, and they talked the whole time about land and cattle and water and the coming winter, and that evening Harold invited him to stay for supper without any particular ceremony, as if it were simply the obvious next thing. After supper, when Wallace had gone and Clara was upstairs and the house was quiet, Harold sat in his chair by the fire and looked at his daughter for a long moment. "He is a good man," Harold said. Alberta felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for a while. "Yes," she said. "He is not rich," Harold said. "No, he will be," Harold said, with the certainty of a man who knows how to evaluate potential. "If he works the way I've seen him work these past weeks, and if he gets his own land, he will build something real." He paused. "It'll take time." "Time is not a hardship," Alberta said. Harold looked at the fire. "Your mother would have liked him," he said. Alberta's breath caught. Her father did not speak of her mother often. When he did, it was always significant. "She would have liked him very much," Alberta agreed softly. Harold nodded once. Then he said, "If he comes to me with a proper question, I will give him a proper answer." Alberta understood exactly what this meant. She kept her composure, which required some effort, and said, "I will make sure he knows." She told Wallace the next time she saw him, 3 days later, at the fence line in the cold December air, where they had met so many times now, that the particular section of fence felt like it was partly theirs. She told him what her father had said, all of it, including the part about her mother, and Wallace listened to all of it with that quality of complete attention. "I was planning to ask him," Wallace said quietly. "I've been waiting until I had the land matter settled. I want to have something concrete to offer, not just intentions." "I know," Alberta said, "but Father is ready. You do not have to wait for the land to be perfect." He looked at her. "What do I have to wait for?" "Nothing," she said. "As far as I'm concerned." On the first Saturday of December, 1878, Wallace Slater sat across from Harold Grayson in the sitting room of the Grayson Ranch house, while Alberta and Clara were in the kitchen making an elaborate amount of unnecessary noise with the pots and pans, and asked Harold Grayson for his daughter's hand. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, which Alberta knew because she counted. Then she heard her father's voice, distinct and clear through the kitchen door, saying something she could not quite make out, and then Wallace's voice answering, and then a silence. Then Harold Grayson came into the kitchen with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who has just done something he is relieved to have done, and he looked at his daughter with eyes that were a little bright, and he said, "He is a decent man, Alberta. He is a genuinely decent man." "Yes," she said. "He asked," Harold said, "and I said yes." He paused. "Though I told him he had better have that north pasture land sorted within the year or we would have words about it." Clara made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a cry of delight, and threw her arms around her father's neck, which startled him considerably, and he patted her back with the awkward affection of a man who was not accustomed to being embraced suddenly. Alberta walked out of the kitchen and into the sitting room, where Wallace was standing by the window with the winter light behind him and his hat in his hands, and when he turned and saw her, the smile that came to his face was the one she had first seen in Mrs. Beatty's bakery, the unguarded one, and it was even better than she remembered. She crossed the room to him and he took both her hands in his, and they stood there in the sitting room of her father's house with December light coming through the window and everything resolved and real and utterly certain. "Alberta Grayson," he said in that quiet way of his. "Wallace Slater," she said, "I would very much like to marry you." "I would very much like that too," she said, and because she was who she was, she added, "I intend to continue keeping the ranch books." He laughed, which was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. "I would not have it any other way," he said. They were married in the spring of 1879, on the second Saturday in April, which in Wyoming was still cold enough that the women wore their wool wraps and the men their heavy coats. But the sky was that deep, relentless blue, and the first green was just beginning to show in the low places where the snow melt collected. The ceremony was held in the small white church in Elk Ridge, which was not large but was full, because the Grayson family was known throughout the county, and because Mrs. Beatty had told every person she knew about the match and had done so with considerable enthusiasm. Harold Grayson walked his daughter down the aisle with his jaw set and his eyes too bright, the expression of a man who is holding himself together through the sheer force of dignity and not entirely succeeding. Clara was behind them with a small bouquet of early wildflowers, the first ones that had come up in the low ground near the creek, pale purple and white, and she was crying openly and cheerfully and not doing anything about it. Wallace stood at the front of the church in a good dark coat he had bought for the occasion, the best one he had ever owned, and when Alberta came through the door on her father's arm, he looked at her the way she had known he would look at her, the way he had looked at her from the beginning, as if she were the thing that mattered most in any room she entered, and her heart was so full she thought it might not be entirely containable. The minister was a kind man named Reverend Holt who had a gentle sense of what a ceremony ought to feel like, and the words he spoke were simple and true, and when Wallace said his vows, he said them looking directly at Alberta, with that quiet, absolute certainty that was the thing she loved most about him. And when she said hers, she said them back to him the same way, directly and without equivocation, because she had never done anything halfway in her life and she was not about to start now. When Reverend Holt said they might kiss, Wallace cupped her face in both his hands with an extraordinary gentleness, and Alberta, who had been composed through the entire ceremony, felt something crack open behind her composure that was entirely welcome and entirely right. The party afterward was at the Grayson Ranch, because it was the largest available space, and because Mrs. Beatty had organized the food with the efficiency of a military general and the affection of a woman who had watched this romance develop over coffee and butter biscuits and was delighted to see it reach its proper conclusion. There was music from 3 men with a fiddle and 2 guitars, and there was dancing on the packed dirt outside, and there was enough food to feed twice the number of people present, and the sky above them went from afternoon blue to the deep purple of dusk to the extraordinary blaze of stars that only the open Wyoming plain could produce. Harold Grayson danced one dance with his daughter, a slow one, and did not say anything for most of it. Near the end, he said quietly, You were right." Alberta looked at her father. "I usually am," she said gently. He huffed, which was as close as Harold Grayson got to a laugh when he was feeling emotional. "Your mother was the same way," he said. And then, after a pause, "I miss her." "So do I," Alberta said, "but I think she is here tonight." Harold pulled back to look at his daughter's face, and whatever he saw there made him nod once, firmly, and then he handed her back to her husband with the careful formality of a man transferring something precious. And Wallace took her hand and led her into another dance, and Harold went to find himself a glass of whiskey and Mrs. Beatty, with whom he ended up talking for an hour about cattle prices. Clara danced with everyone who asked her and several people she asked herself, and at some point in the evening she found Alberta at the edge of the gathering and hugged her with all her strength and said, "I am so happy." And Alberta held her younger sister and said, "So am I, Clara." "So am I." Wallace had secured the land, just as he had told Harold he would. The North Pasture parcel came through in February, 160 acres of Wyoming land with good water access, and a section of it that would carry decent grass through most of the grazing season. It was not the 40,000 acres of Elias Crawford's family holding, but it was real and it was his. And in the months between the engagement and the wedding, he had begun the work of building on it with the same steady, unhurried commitment he brought to everything. After the wedding, they lived in a small house at the edge of Harold Grayson's property, while Wallace built their own place on the North Pasture land, which he did over the course of that spring and summer with help from Harold and the ranch hands, and 2 men from Elk Ridge who did carpentry work. Alberta was involved in every decision about the house, because of course she was, and the result was a structure that was practical and solid, and had, at Alberta's insistence, a window in the kitchen that looked north toward the mountains, because she had always wanted to cook with the mountains in view. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty, because the first year of anything real never is. They had to learn each other in the way that you can only learn a person when you are sharing every day with them, and there were moments when his quietness frustrated her, and moments when her directness left him with nothing to push back against, and the negotiations of 2 strong-willed people sharing a life required patience and humor and a willingness to say, plainly, when something was not working. They had those things, and the negotiations, while sometimes heated, always concluded somewhere real. There was one particular argument in September of that first year, over the management of the North Pasture cattle, and the question of whether to sell before winter or hold through, and it was a genuine disagreement with real stakes, and they went back and forth about it with the frank vehemence of 2 people who both knew what they were talking about and both believed they were right. It ended with Wallace sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts Alberta had laid out and acknowledging, with visible effort, that her projections were correct and his instinct had been overriding the numbers. "You were right," he said. "I know," she said. And then, because she loved him and because it was true, "But your instinct about the Kearney market was right, and mine wasn't, and I should have listened to you last spring." He looked up at her. "You're keeping score." "I am keeping fair score," she said with precision. He looked at her for a moment, and then that smile came, the unguarded one, and she felt her own mouth curve in response, and the argument was over in the way the best arguments between people who love each other end, not with surrender but with genuine resolution. In the spring of 1880, Alberta learned she was expecting a child. She told Wallace in the evening after supper, sitting in the house they had built together on the North Pasture land with the mountains visible through the kitchen window and the sound of the Wyoming spring coming in from outside. The birds returned, the creek running high with snowmelt. Wallace was very still for a moment, the way he was still when something reached him completely. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, and his face was full of something she did not have a word for but recognized as the same thing she was feeling. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was who he was. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also very pleased." He squeezed her hand. "So am I," he said softly, "more than I know how to say." "You do not have to say it," she told him. "I can see it." She could. It was all over him, the kind of feeling that a reserved, careful man sometimes shows more clearly than an expressive one, because when it breaks through it is entirely genuine and entirely without performance. She told her father the following Sunday. Harold Grayson sat in his chair by the fire, which he had done every Sunday evening for 30 years, and when she told him, he was quiet for a moment, and then he put his hand over his eyes and stayed that way for long enough that Alberta began to be concerned. And then he lowered his hand and he was smiling, in the way she almost never saw him smile, wide and unguarded and a little helpless. "Your mother would have been beside herself," he said. "She would have," Alberta agreed. "And she would have had very specific opinions about everything." Harold laughed, really laughed, which was rarer than the smile and even better. Clara, who had been waiting in the next room with barely contained anticipation, came bursting through the door at the sound of it and looked between them and figured it out immediately, and produced a noise of pure delight that frightened one of the dogs outside into barking. The child was born in November of 1880, a boy, strong and loud, and possessed from his very first hours of a dark hair that was entirely his father's and a determined set to his jaw that could have come from either parent. They named him Thomas Harold Slater. Thomas for the simple satisfaction of the name, and Harold for the man who had been persuaded, slowly and honestly, to become the grandfather standing outside the bedroom door with his hat in his hands, waiting. Wallace was with Alberta throughout the birth, which was not the universal practice of the time, but was entirely in keeping with who he was, and he held her hand through the worst of it and said nothing useless but was simply and absolutely present, which was what she needed and what she had known she would get from him. When Thomas was placed in Wallace's arms for the first time, something happened to his face that Alberta, exhausted and spent and entirely satisfied, watched from her pillow with a feeling so enormous she could not locate its edges. He looked at the baby with an expression that was almost frightened in its intensity, not from fear but from the kind of love that arrives all at once and has no precedent. "Hello," Wallace said to the baby, in a voice barely above a whisper. "I am your father." Thomas, who was 4 minutes old and had no use for speeches, scrunched his face and made a sound of profound protest at the general situation, and Wallace made a sound that was low and startled and unmistakably a laugh, and Alberta reached out and put her hand on his arm, and that was all. Harold met his grandson in the doorway and held him with the practiced ease of a man who had held babies before, and the contained emotion of a man who had not expected to feel this particular way about it. He said very little. He did not need to. Clara, who had been there all day and had been an invaluable and steady presence throughout, held Thomas last and looked down at his small, fierce face and said, "You are going to be entirely too stubborn for anyone's good, and it is going to be wonderful." She was not wrong. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because life on the Wyoming plain in the 1880s never was. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the constant labor of keeping land productive and animals healthy. And there were the broader pressures of the territory that touched everyone, the ongoing uncertainties of property law, the encroachments of the railroad interests, the economic cycles that lifted and dropped cattle prices with infuriating regularity. But the Slater ranch grew. Wallace had an eye for land and a mind for management that turned the original 160 acres into 300 within 4 years, through the careful accumulation of adjacent parcels as they became available, and the steady, unglamorous work of making each piece productive before moving to the next. Alberta kept the books with the meticulous precision she had always brought to the Grayson Ranch accounts, and between them they built something that was genuinely theirs, made of real decisions and real labor and real knowledge of the land they were working. Harold Grayson, who rode over to the Slater Ranch every Sunday for dinner with a regularity that became one of the fixed constants of their lives, watched the growth of what his daughter and son-in-law were building with an expression that was, over time, less complex and more simply proud. He and Wallace had become something that was more than a comfortable relationship and less than friendship. Something that had its own specific shape built from shared work and shared interest, and the particular bond of men who respect each other's competence. One Sunday in the autumn of 1883, when Thomas was nearly 3 years old and had recently demonstrated his grandmother's stubbornness and his grandfather's stride and his father's capacity for silence all in one remarkable afternoon, Harold sat on the porch of the Slater ranch house in the October sunlight and looked out at the north pasture land where Wallace had run a new fence line that week. Alberta brought him coffee and sat beside him in the other chair the way she did most Sundays when the weather allowed. "This is good land," Harold said. "It is," she agreed. "He has worked it well." Harold was quiet for a moment. "He has made a life here." "We have made a life here," Alberta said with gentle precision. Harold looked at her. The smallest smile moved through his face. "You have," he agreed. They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who no longer need to manage each other. "Alberta," Harold said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "For what?" "For the 6 men," he said. "I was trying to do right by you. I know that. But I was not listening to who you were. I was listening to what I thought you needed." He paused. "Your mother would have listened better." Alberta was quiet for a moment. "Father," she said, "you could not have found him for me. No one could have. He was on a road I took myself." Harold looked out at the land again. "True," he said. "And you came around," she said. "That is not nothing. A lot of fathers do not come around." Harold made the sound that was almost a laugh. "A lot of fathers do not have daughters who are impossible to argue with." "Exactly," Alberta said. They sat in the autumn sunlight and drank their coffee. And from inside the house came the sound of Thomas saying something earnest and incomprehensible to Wallace, and Wallace's low voice answering him with complete seriousness, as he always did, treating the child's questions as the important things they were to a 3-year-old discovering the world. Clara came out to visit on the first day of November, as she did regularly now that she was 18 and had her own social life in Elk Ridge, and a job helping Mrs. Beatty at the bakery, which suited her extremely well because she was sociable and warm and had her father's appetite for hard work and her sister's sharpness underneath. She arrived on her horse in the early afternoon with her dark curls escaping from under her hat and her cheeks red from the cold ride, and she burst into the Slater house with her usual wholehearted energy and immediately picked up Thomas and spun him around until he shrieked with delight. "You are growing," she told him accusingly. "Stop it." Thomas, who had been able to say his Aunt Clara's name for approximately 4 months and said it with significant enthusiasm, grabbed her face in both his small hands and told her something important in the mixture of real words and invented ones that was his current mode of communication. "I completely agree," Clara said gravely. Alberta watched her sister with Thomas and felt the warmth of it settle into her chest alongside everything else. This family she had, this life she had chosen, this man she had found on a broken road and brought home to her father and said, "This is the one." On the last evening of that November, when Thomas was asleep in his small room, and the house was quiet, and the winter wind was doing what Wyoming winter winds did, Alberta and Wallace sat by their own fire in the house they had built, and she was reading, and he was looking at the survey maps he was always working through, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world and also the most extraordinary. She looked up at some point and found him already looking at her, which happened sometimes, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking at you." "That is not nothing," she said. He smiled, the unguarded one. "No," he agreed, "it is not." She set her book down and looked at him properly. "Wallace." "Alberta." "I told my father that first day I talked to him about you that I would find the man myself and bring him home and say this is the one." She paused. "I did not expect to be right quite so completely." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was feeling something large, Then he said, "I found you on a broken road." "I found you on the same road," she said. "I just had better transportation." He laughed and she laughed, and the fire crackled in the quiet Wyoming house, and Thomas made a small sound in his sleep from the other room, and Wallace got up and went to check on him and came back saying he was fine, just dreaming, and sat back down across from her. "Are you happy?" she asked him. Not the way you ask when you are uncertain, but the way you ask when you want to share something specific. "Completely," he said, without hesitation. "So am I," she said. "I wanted you to know that I know what I have. I want to be sure you know that I never take it for granted." He looked at her with those gray eyes that she knew so well now, the eyes she had first seen in the morning light on a Wyoming road with a broken wagon at her back, and he said, "Neither do I, not a single day of it." Spring came again to the Wyoming plain in 1884 with the particular exuberance of springs that follow hard winters, everything green and insistent, the creek running high, the horses restless and glad. Thomas, who was 3.5, was at the age of following his father everywhere with a concentration that Wallace found both touching and occasionally exhausting, because Thomas's approach to following his father was to ask an uninterrupted series of questions about everything they passed, encountered, or thought about. "He is going to be a surveyor," Wallace told Alberta one evening. "He is going to be whatever he decides to be," Alberta said, "though I note he already has opinions about the cattle management. He told me this morning that the east pasture fence needs replacing." "He is not wrong," Alberta said. In the summer of that year, Alberta discovered she was expecting again, and she told Wallace the same way she had told him the first time, in the evening after supper at their kitchen table with the mountain view through the window. His response was the same as the first time, that immediate stillness and then the warmth breaking through, and he reached for her hand across the table. "Boy or girl?" he said, not as a prediction but just as a wondering. "I do not know," she said. "Either would be perfectly welcome." The second child was a girl, born in March of 1885, in the same room where Thomas had been born, healthy and furious, and with her mother's brown eyes and a quantity of dark hair that caused the midwife to comment favorably. They named her Alina for Alberta's mother, which made Harold Grayson's face do something complicated and beautiful when he heard it. Thomas, who was 4.5 and had been given significant advance notice of the arrival of a sibling, received Alina with the cautious evaluation of a child who has been prepared for something without quite being able to imagine it. He looked at her for a long time when Wallace brought him in to see her, with the kind of seriousness he had inherited from his father. "She is very small," Thomas said finally. "You were very small once," Wallace told him. Thomas considered this with evident skepticism. "You can help look after her," Alberta said from the bed. "That is an important job." Thomas looked at Alina again, at her small, fierce face and her moving fists, and something shifted in his expression. "I will do it," he said, with the gravity of someone accepting a significant commission. And he did. From his very earliest capacity to do anything useful, Thomas was Alina's most dedicated ally, teaching her things and showing her things and protecting her with the instinctive loyalty of a firstborn who takes responsibility seriously. Harold came on the Sunday after Alina was born and held his granddaughter the way he had held Thomas, with that same practiced ease and that same quietly enormous feeling. He looked at Alberta holding Alina and then at Wallace standing beside her, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Alina would have been proud." "I think she knows," Alberta said. Harold nodded. He looked at the baby in his arms, at her small closed eyes and the dark curl of hair on her forehead. "Alina Grayson Slater," he said quietly, trying the name. "Alina Ruth Slater," Alberta said. "Ruth was her middle name, mother's." Harold looked up at his daughter. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you," and that was all. The years built on each other the way good years do, each one becoming the foundation of the next, solid enough to support what came after. The Slater ranch continued to grow and to thrive, not extravagantly but genuinely, with the kind of prosperity that is built on real work and real knowledge, and the good judgment of two people who are both capable and are honest with each other about what they see. Clara, at 22, married a man she found herself, a schoolteacher named James Hartley who had come to Elk Ridge from Ohio to take over the school, and who was quiet and kind and looked at Clara the way she deserved to be looked at. Harold gave his blessing to this match considerably faster than he had given it to Wallace, which Wallace had the grace not to mention. The four of them, Alberta and Wallace and Clara and James, made up a family circle that expanded Harold's Sunday dinners into something large and warm and regularly chaotic, especially once the children arrived, Thomas and Alina and later James and Clara's own son, a red-cheeked boy named Harold Jr. who was called Young Harry, and who was, by every observable measure, the most cheerful human being in 3 counties. Thomas, growing up with the ranch and the surveying maps and his father's patient teaching, developed an extraordinary grasp of the land at a very young age. By the time he was 12, he could read a survey map with the same fluency his father had, and Wallace was teaching him to do the actual survey work, the sighting and measuring and calculating, and Thomas absorbed it with the quiet intensity of a child who has found the thing he is genuinely made for. Alina, 2 years younger and entirely different in temperament, was her mother's daughter in the most specific possible way, direct and precise and possessed of a mind that went at problems from unexpected angles. She also had, from a very early age, a gift for horses that exceeded even her father's considerable skill, as if she simply spoke the language and the horses knew it. And by the time she was 8, she was riding better than most adults and had strong opinions about the management of every horse on the property. Alberta, watching her daughter with the horses one afternoon when Alina was 9, felt her father's hand on her shoulder. Harold had come to stand beside her without her hearing him, which was a trick he had of moving quietly when he was feeling something he did not want to announce. "Looks like someone else I know," Harold said. Alberta looked at Alina, who was working with a young horse that had been difficult all week, moving around it slowly and patiently, talking to it in a low, continuous voice, and the horse was beginning to settle. "Mother," Alberta guessed, "you," Harold said. "The way you would not be hurried and would not be pushed, and eventually the thing you were working on just gave way and became what you wanted it to be." He paused. "Though your mother would have said she recognized it from herself." Alberta smiled. "That tracks," she said. On the evening of Wallace and Alberta's 10th wedding anniversary, in April of 1889, they sat together on the porch of their house, the house they had built, watching the Wyoming spring evening settle into dusk. Thomas was 13, and inside doing his schoolwork with a diligence that pleased both his parents enormously. Alina was 11, and had recently informed the family that she intended to breed horses professionally when she grew up, and had presented a plan for this that was, everyone had been forced to admit, quite well thought out. Harold was inside with the children, which was where he usually ended up on Sunday evenings now, telling Thomas some story about the early days of the ranch while Alina listened and interjected corrections whenever she thought he was exaggerating, which was frequently. On the porch, in the dusk, Wallace and Alberta sat in the chairs they had carried out specifically, with coffee that had gone a little cold, and the mountains on the horizon were darkening to purple against the last of the sky's light. 10 years, Wallace said. 10 years, Alberta agreed. "Do you remember the wagon wheel?" "I remember the wagon wheel every time I take the North Road," she said. "I think about it." "What do you think?" "I think about how close I came to not going to Elk Ridge that morning. My father offered to send one of the hands. I very nearly let him." She paused. "And then I think that probably if it had not been the wheel it would have been something else. We were going to find each other." Wallace looked at her. "You believe that?" "I believe that I was looking for something specific and it was out there waiting to be found, and I went looking with more persistence than sense and I found it." She looked back at him. "I believe in the particular combination of stubbornness and luck that put both of us on the same road." He reached over and took her hand, which he did often still, as naturally as breathing. She turned her hand in his, the way she had learned to do, and they sat in the Wyoming evening with their hands together and the mountains going dark and the sound of Harold's voice inside telling Thomas something about bison that Thomas was almost certainly fact-checking. "I want to tell you something," Wallace said. "Tell me," she said. "I have not always been good at saying things. You know that. I know that. But I want to say this clearly, because 10 years deserves clarity." He paused in that thoughtful way of his. "I was on that road every day for weeks before the morning I found you on it. I had ridden it 40 times, and the morning I found you there with your hands on your hips looking at that wheel like it had personally offended you, I thought." He stopped. "What?" she said. "I thought, here is a person who is going to matter to me," he said. "Before I knew your name, just from the way you were standing." He paused again. "I was right." Alberta looked at him, this man with his gray eyes and his quiet voice and his absolute steadiness. This man she had found herself on a broken road and brought home to her father and said, "This is the one," and she thought about all the years that had followed, all the work and the seasons and the children and the dinners and the arguments and the laughter and every ordinary extraordinary day. "Wallace," she said, "Alberta, you matter to me too. You have mattered to me every single day." She paused. "And you were right that morning." "About what?" "Whatever you were thinking, whatever it was, you were right." He smiled, the unguarded one, and inside the house she could hear Alina's voice rising sharply as she caught Harold in another exaggeration, and Harold laughing about it, and Thomas's quieter voice offering some specific correction, and she thought, "All of this is mine. This is the life I chose, and it chose me back, and every day of it has been exactly what it should be." The stars came out over Wyoming the way they always did, extravagantly, as if the sky were showing off, and the two of them sat on the porch of the house they had built on the land they had made productive, and they were entirely themselves and entirely together, and that was everything. In the summer of that same year, 1889, Wyoming achieved statehood, which it had been working toward for years and which was cause for considerable celebration throughout the territory. In Elk Ridge, there was a gathering in the main street with music and speeches and a great deal of noise, and the Slater family attended in full, Harold Grayson walking with Thomas and Alina on either side of him like an honor guard, while Wallace and Alberta walked behind, and Clara and James were there with young Harry, who was attempting to explain statehood to Alina in terms he had invented himself that had very little to do with the actual process. Alberta stood in the main street of Elk Ridge, where she had once sat in Mrs. Beatty's bakery over coffee, and watched a man with gray eyes walk through the door and change the direction of everything, and she looked around at what was assembled. Her husband beside her, their children somewhere in the crowd, her father, her sister, and her family, the town and the people in it who had been part of her life for as long as she could remember, and the open sky above it, all that was as big and as relentless as it had always been, Wyoming's great unchanging gift. Wallace was watching the same thing she was watching. She could tell by the angle of his head, the way he took in the whole of it. "What are you thinking?" she asked him. "I am thinking," he said, "that I am glad I came north." She slipped her arm through his. "So am I," she said. From somewhere in the crowd, Alina's voice was audible above the general noise, telling someone something with absolute conviction, and from a different direction Thomas was visible moving through the crowd with his father's quiet purposefulness, and Harold Grayson was standing at the edge of the main street looking at the sky with the face of a man who is accounting for his blessings and finding them numerous. Mrs. Beatty appeared at Alberta's elbow with 2 cups of lemonade, because Mrs. Beatty had been providing refreshment at every significant occasion in Elk Ridge for 30 years, and she was not about to stop for statehood. "Well," Mrs. Beatty said, handing over the cups with the satisfaction of someone who has watched something develop correctly from the very beginning. "Wyoming. Wyoming," Alberta agreed, taking the cup. Mrs. Beatty looked at Wallace and then at Alberta, and she had the expression of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking at and is very pleased by it. "You know," she said, The day you two sat in my bakery and I brought you both a second cup of coffee, I thought, there is a story being written right here. Were you right? Wallace asked her. Mrs. Beatty smiled. I am always right, she said, and moved away to provide lemonade to other people. Alberta and Wallace stood in the new state of Wyoming in the summer sunshine, with the children somewhere in the crowd and the music starting up again from the end of the street, and they looked at each other the way they had always looked at each other, directly and without armor, and everything that needed to be said was said in that, as it usually was. She had turned down every man her father had chosen for her, 6 men in 3 years, men with money and land and the wrong kind of looking. And then she had found one her father had never met, on a road she had taken herself, and she had brought him home and said to her father, with complete and simple certainty, "This is the one." She had been right. She had known she would be, and she had been, and all the years since had confirmed it in the specific and unambiguous language of a life that was genuinely lived, genuinely built, genuinely loved. The music played in the main street of Elk Ridge, Wyoming, in the long golden afternoon of that summer, and Alberta Grayson Slater stood beside the man she had chosen with her whole self, and she thought, I would take every broken road again, 100 times over, to end up exactly here.